and then you can hit record when we start talking about. Oh, okay, fine. Welcome,
agreed. Everyone to the VT List Live. And today we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 2. Andy, tell us a little bit about your history and your love for Hannah's song in 1 Samuel, just to get us into the text here.
Okay, well, as many of you know, I'm a translation consultant with UBS. And before that, I studied European literature and then got into biblical languages. And in my master's degree, I worked on the Song of Hannah. Actually, you know, at that stage of an academic life, you're looking for topics and so on. And the fact of the matter is, I chose the Song of Hannah simply because I had some very dear friends who were going through the agonies of childlessness and longing to have children. They now are a happy and full family, and praise God for that. But my choice of the text was for purely personal reasons, not for academic reasons at all. But it turned out that this was a very fertile topic of study. So my master's degree for 1 year was spent really working on just on these 10 verses. I later went on and did a PhD on the Psalms. And then came into Bible translation work. But I was looking at my old notes in preparation for this. I didn't do a lot of preparation, don't worry. This isn't going to be a big lecture, but it was quite interesting to look at that stuff that I worked on 30 years ago in my master's degree. If anybody's very interested in Song of Hannah, my master's dissertation and a published paper that came out of it in the Journal of Jewish Studies, both of them are available on my academia.edu webpage, so you can go and have a look at it.
That's great. Thank you, Andy. It's always encouraging to hear how people continue to apply some of these ancient texts, some of this. I mean, it's a miracle, isn't it, that ancient Israelites, biblical Hebrew poetry from a different millennium can be applied to life circumstances today. I just find it really beautiful. Good. So today, I think we decided that we were going to look at verses 1 through 10. Does that sound about right? 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. So should we just go ahead and jump into verse 1 then?
There's a couple of things I wanted to say just to start, if you don't mind. But I won't waste too much time because I know people want to get into the Hebrew text. I know that you're all here because you want to improve your Hebrew. I want to just say a couple of very quick words about what I feel are really important things as you're pushing forward the Hebrew. The things that I always say to people I'm teaching are really work hard on your vocabulary. Make sure you've got your basic vocabulary, learn it by frequency, learn the most common words, and really work on fluency. And my fluency in reading really came after I finished my PhD. So I would say that when I finished my PhD, I was still looking at a page of characters, not words that I could read fluently. I can read quite fluently now, but I couldn't at that time. And it was because of the old-fashioned style of education that I had in learning Hebrew. Many of you have probably been to Jerusalem. You've studied in a much better way than I ever did. And so you may be more fluent. And then also these days, because I'm working in Bible translation, it's very important to focus on pragmatics. What's actually the function of the text? Not just the words and the tiny little details, but what's the function of the text? I found that important. Don't focus very much in doing poetry on things that other people might think are very important. Some people think the accents are extremely important. Other people are into what they call discourse, chiasm and peak and things like that. They're not very interesting to me. They might be interesting to you, that's fine, but you won't hear much from me. Sorry, those are not areas that I think are so key. I would like to show people a couple of things in paratext, and we're going to continue with my paratext screen. So let me share my screen. Since I believe that most of you, if not all, are people working in Bible translation, so you use paratext, I assume. So I hope you see my screen okay. And this is not the world's most beautiful layout, but it's just to illustrate a couple of things. In use of paratext, I do encourage you, if you're looking at poetry, lay out the Hebrew text in stichometric format with the cantillation. So some people are not aware of this, but you can go to cantillation and you can choose. I suggest you don't bother with Revia and Tifhat, the last two accents, but you mark those ones, and then it will give you a nice layout, which is, I think, as good a layout of the Hebrew text as any. Also, just to encourage you, when you've got the Hebrew text open, anytime that you're going through, of course, you know that you can click on a word and you can go to a dictionary, so you can take a less common word like that. You can right-click on it and then go to a dictionary. But I really encourage everybody to use references in all books. That is really the best, the most useful tool. A concordance is better than a dictionary because it shows you where something has been used. You can create a new list, and then quite quickly that not very frequent word, you can see that it occurs once in 1 Samuel and 3 times in the Psalms. That's useful information. It tells you something about that kind of word and the place that it has in Old Testament literature.
Sorry,
also,
Andy.
Yes.
Can I ask a question? Yeah, I have
Absolutely.
the impression that your source language window has some more advanced features than mine. Do you have
probably
is that perhaps a beta version or?
I doubt it. Well, it probably is a beta version. Nevertheless, probably the two things that you're noticing in the source language window there. One is that it's blue. Well, that's just a setting, and you can change the font you can go here to font and color settings in the source language window. So you can change the color and have a different font if you'd like. That's fine. Be careful with choosing another font. Several of the commercial Hebrew fonts don't support the accents because they're intended for modern Hebrew. So you might lose accent. Having just said that, I don't think the accents are so important. I do still want to be able to read them. So do be careful what font you choose. You might lose some stuff, but that's the color. Then you can also see these symbols on the right, and that's what I was just about to mention, that you can view consultant notes projects within the source text window, right? Not project notes, but consultant notes. And you can do that through the menu here. You can go to show consultant notes. And so there's a range of consultant notes projects that I have access to by myself and by friends and colleagues. As well as ones that are built in. So the blue globe there is the global consultant notes, which are built into Paratext. They're all quite old, but they're done by some of the sort of heroes of the Bible translation world. Here you can see some by chance. There are some here by Bob Bascom, Lauren Bleasy. Those are the only two names I see immediately, but Jan Sterk. So some of the great old people from 1980s, 90s, 2000s who were the sort of really, some of them really the founders of the kind of Bible translation culture that we all inhabit now. And they're built into Paratext. You have access to them and you can choose to view them with your source text, or of course, like, because they're a consultant notes project, you can view them in any project, in any target language project or in a resource. But there's also a purple triangle there, or purple sort of leftward facing arrow. That is my own consultant's notes project. This is AWRCN, my own consultant notes. Now you can see them on the screen. They're consultant notes that I've written over many years. You can see the ones that for 1 Samuel, apparently I've not worked on 1 Samuel since 2008 or 2011 in projects in countries where I've worked, Nigeria and Chad. So that's a consultant notes project. Is there anything else that was strange there?
Well, the hierarchy,
Well, the hierarchy. Well, that is the thing that I just mentioned, which is cantillation. You go to cantillation, you choose,
okay,
right, and then you choose use indentation, and that will depend on which accents you've chosen. I'm suggesting you choose the top 5, which are the main, most significant structural accents, and then click on use indentation, and then it will lay it out in the way that you have there. And it has been like that for at least the last 8 or 10 years in Paratext. This is not a new feature that I'm showing you, but I'm showing it to you because many people don't know that it's there, and I hope this can be helpful. Drew, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, if someone has opened their Hebrew Bible in Paratext, but you're not seeing all these features, it could be that you've opened the Hebrew resource rather than the source language tool, which I sometimes see happening. So you need to click on the Aleph, right, in order to open the Hebrew source language tool versus opening the Hebrew Bible as a resource, which I find a bit confusing.
Well, or you go to if you go to open, you can choose open projects, and you can find the Hebrew text under projects. But if you choose source language text, you will only see 3. Yes. And that's because these texts are the proper source language texts, and the normal ones are the top 2. The bottom one is a new one, only coming very recently, the open Hebrew Bible. That's another thing. Don't worry about that. But if you click on one of these, it will open it as a source language window, not as a normal project window. All okay? Now, my Zoom is not really helping me with the view. so I can't see when somebody raises their hand, unfortunately. But if you do have comments, then please put them in the chat, and I'll try to work out how I can actually see the chat and then respond to any comments as I'm going on. And do feel free to interrupt me. We're not so many people that it would be bad for you to interrupt. So the Song of Hannah, apart from my own personal interest in it that I mentioned, is a very important text for the Old Testament. It's in the story of Hannah that we have the first or use of Tsebaot, the divine name, which is to do with the multitudes of Israel coming out of Egypt. I don't think it's got anything to do with stars or lots of angels or whatever. It's the first use of Mashiach to refer to the king, and the first use of the word Chassid to refer to a faithful one. There may be another special key term in the psalm, but those three are ones that really strike me as very important biblical key terms that actually come for the first time in the story of Hannah and in her song. It's one of the three songs that structure 1 and 2 Samuel. We have Hannah at the beginning, we have the Song of David at the end, and in the middle of 1 and 2 Samuel, of course, separating the two books, we have the lament over Saul and Jonathan. Song of Hannah is important for Christians, of course, as well, because it's the precursor to the Magnificat. Magnificat is very clearly based on the Song of Hannah. Whoever wrote the Magnificat, or if it was Mary composed it on the spot, then it was based on this song. It has very complex textual history. The Septuagint text of the Song of Hannah has 7 kola that have just been taken from Jeremiah 9. Qumran, probably 2. There's a very close relationship between the Dead Sea Scrolls 4Q Sameh scroll and the Septuagint. But there are also other connections with biblical texts. In the Septuagint, of course, we have the book of Odes that contains several songs from narrative context. So Song of Hannah is Ode 3. And there are clear connections, whole verses copied and linked in Psalm 113. There's a close connection with Psalm 99. Jeremiah 9 I've already mentioned, and the quotations that then come in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2 Corinthians 10 about boasting, they appear in Jeremiah 9 and also in the Septuagint version of Hannah's song, because they've been copied there. So very complex textual history, and that's all interesting for certain people. Oh yes, what's the link between the song and the text? That's always important when we have songs in narrative context. How do they connect? People always tend to notice that in verse 5b, we've got the Akara, the barren woman who's given birth to 7 children. That's great, except that the narrative context tells us that Hannah actually gave birth to Samuel and then 5 others, so she had a total of 6, not 7. Okay, you can deal with that as you wish. But then, of course, the mention of the Messiah at the end of Hannah's song in verse 10, it's clearly a kingly Messiah, not a priestly Messiah. Of course, in the time of Hannah, there was no king. So that's why Hannah is regarded as a prophetess, a very important prophetic figure, prophesying the Messiah. Although, of course, you could wonder whether that reference to the Messiah had something, or that this song was put in Hannah's mouth, perhaps because of the connection with Eli and Samuel, who were priests. The number 3 is really important in this song. You're going to see that in verses 1 and 2 and verse 10, they have tricola instead of bicola. You're used to in Hebrew poetry being, parallelism, 2-cola, but here we have some tricola. That's relatively rare in biblical poetry. In verse 1, we have the 3 body parts. We have a heart and a horn and a mouth. And that's a little bit like the 3 parts that we have in Psalm 1, sit, walk, stand, which I think as a group you've looked at. Already in verse 1, we have the 3 key actants in the Psalms. We have the self, God, and the enemies. Those 3 really structure the whole book of Psalms, but all these other Psalms in narrative context too. And one really important thing from my own research is that there are 3 holies in the Greek and the Dead Sea Scrolls version of this psalm. 3 holies is significant, of course, holy, holy, holy. And we find that also in Psalm 99, but it's somehow been imported into the textual history of this psalm. In the Masoretic text, we only have 1 holy, but we have 3 in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint. So those are things that some of you might be interested in following up. I think they're fascinating, but we're here to read Hebrew. So let's get into the Hebrew text. So I think somebody else can read aloud. You can read from my screen, or I guess you've got the text on your own screen. Let me make this a bit larger. People always complain it's a bit too small. Can I have a volunteer to read, please? First one. Well, I sort out the size on my screen. Over to somebody else to read.
Okay,
Right.
I could start.
Oh.
ותתפלל חנה ותאמר, עלת ליבי באדוני, רמה רמה קרני באדוני, רהב בי על אויבי, כי שמחתי בישועתך.
Beautiful, beautiful. And the one mistake you made, I'm very grateful for, because thank you for making a mistake, because it brings up my first point. The word was vatomar, and you quite rightly naturally went for vatomer. Vatomer would be the normal form, and the reason it's actually that third word in the verse is vatomar is because it has an accent on top of it. You can see that the zakef parvom at the top is marking it, and so it becomes, instead of being vatoma, it becomes vatomar, and that's called pause. I expect some of you have come across that before, but pause, that kind of stress that we have, typically it comes on atnach in the middle of a verse, or on siluk at the end of a verse. We have it in this verse. Normally the last word of this verse will be bishuatcha, but it becomes bishuatecha because it's got pause and it's got an accent. That siluk accent stresses it, so it turns the shva into a segon. That occurs several times throughout this psalm. We have, well, biltecha in verse 2. You can see, I hope you can see the highlighting there as well. In verse 10, we have examples of this, of pause, giving that extra stress and changing it. So here, for example, in verse 10, we have afse aretz instead of afse eretz. That's a normal thing. It happens throughout Hebrew, and in the Psalms we see it very commonly. In this psalm, however, we have some really weird exceptions. So, for example, in verse 8, this is normal segolate noun tevel, which we would normally expect to be stressed on the first syllable, and siluk, which comes before sof pasuk, that little line, that accent towards the end of the verse, normally comes on the penultimate syllable. But here, on a segolate noun which is already stressed on the first syllable, the accent has shifted to the final syllable. So if you're interested in those kind of things, you can follow up why that is that way. But also this is really odd, because normally I would misread this one. I would normally read ki ladonei motuke aretz, but that's not what it says, is it? It says ki ladonei motuke eretz. So it's got the stress on it on the beginning of a segolate noun. Normally it should be aretz, which is what we had with afse aretz in verse 10, but it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed from eretz to aretz. So either the Masoretes were being not quite consistent, or there's something else going on there in the context. But that's pause. Something I wanted to mention. Let's go back to verse 1. I'm moving back up to verse 1. I don't know if you normally, I should leave the translation to you or do it myself, but let me start myself anyway. Titpalel is a hitpael form of halal to pray. So Hannah prayed and said. Then we have the three body parts that I mentioned, the heart and the horn and the mouth. So my heart is rejoicing in the Lord, my horn is raised in the Lord, and my mouth is wide over my enemies. And then we have ki, and the word ki there is highlighted in my paratext, ki samachti b'shuatecha, because I'm happy in your salvation. Lots of lexical issues there. Samachti is to be happy, but here we've got a perfective form, or the katal form. I don't know if you call it perfective or katal. That's normal with stative verbs. So stative verbs typically with a present meaning occur in the katal form. So ahavti means I love. One of the famous biblical texts is, I have loved you with an everlasting love. That to me is a famous translation mistake. I think it's in Jeremiah, isn't it? It shouldn't be, I have loved you with an everlasting love. It's, I love you with an everlasting love. Ahavat olam ahavticha. Ahavticha, it's a stative verb, so it means I love you. Not I have loved you, but I love you. And so here too, it's I am happy, not I have been happy or something, because it's a stative verb. And then Yeshuatecha could mean your salvation because you rescued me. It could generally mean victory. Quite often Yeshua means a victory, but in this context, probably personal salvation is relevant, isn't it? In the story of Hannah, but also in the context of the psalm that talks about vindication of individuals. The key is important. To me, it sounds quite funny when I say, if I say, you know, my heart is rejoicing and my horn is raised, my mouth is wide over my enemies because I'm happy. That's kind of odd. It's more natural to say my heart is rejoicing, how happy I am. And in fact, that would be right. And if you look at Carl Follingstad's telephone directory, thick, fat PhD on key, you'll discover from that, or there are other resources that are a bit shorter that will show it, that key quite often has an emphatic function, not a causal function. So don't assume that key always is causal. I really think it's not. Raising the horn, you've come across in other contexts, I'm sure. People say that it's something to do with the wild ox. It's a metaphor coming from the wild ox that raises its horns high. That could be true. Horn has other meanings. You remember that horn was famously misunderstood in medieval paintings when Moses came down the mountain with horns. And so you see all these pictures of Moses with horns from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, because Keren also has this meaning of a beam of light or a glow, a shining coming out from him. So I'm not sure where Rama Kani comes from, but it is a regular metaphor in scripture, and obviously has to do with confidence and assertion and being vindicated, often in contexts where somebody's been down and they get vindicated. Now, let me tell you something odd about this verse that I don't think you might find in a commentary or whatever. Let's read it again. I'm going to read it again and just listen to the sound. Just after starting with Hannah's words. Alatz libi badonai, Rama karni badonai, Rachav pi al oyavai, ki samachti b'shuatecha. It rhymes, doesn't it? And that's weird. We don't normally expect rhyme in Hebrew. It's really quite rare to find rhyme in biblical Hebrew. We find all sorts of alliteration and assonance, but actual rhyme is odd. But it only rhymes if you actually read it as Adonai. If you read the Hebrew text as Yahweh, then of course it's not going to rhyme. Now, I'm not trying to say that this is an indication of a very early date of the tradition of saying Adonai instead of the name of God, but it is a funny example, isn't it? In fact, the Song of Hannah is one of those things that people refer to as archaic Hebrew poetry, as one of the very early examples of Hebrew poetry in narrative contexts in the Bible. So it would be one of those earlier texts, so you wouldn't expect here to find any traces of that later tradition of reading Adonai instead of the divine name. Nevertheless, it does make a huge difference whether you read it as Adonai or as the name. Just an odd thing in verse 1 that always strikes me.
Yes, Andy, that's fascinating with the pronunciation of the divine name there. I was just wondering, could we just look a little more closely at horn? I would be interested to know from your translation experience, what sort of strategies have you found among translators to translate this image? In your experience, is it an image, a metaphor that communicates well in the cultures, the languages with which you've worked, or have you found that they've had to employ other strategies to handle this?
Well, I mentioned earlier that I'm quite passionate about the meaning of text and the function and pragmatic function. So I'm not a great fan of literal translations in any way. I don't really see the point. To say that my horn is raised is meaningless in any culture that I've ever worked in, or any language that I've ever spoken. There may be one in which it conveniently happens to be a natural image, in which case, lucky you. But mostly it's meaningless, and so I would certainly like to see it expressed in another way. However, I would generally recommend that it be rendered using a body part. Either a body part you don't have, like a horn, or a body part that you really do have, like your head being raised, or my head's been lifted up, that kind of expression, in order to retain the three body parts that we have here. I find it rather sad when somebody translates the first verse of Psalm 1 and loses the sit, walk, stand parallelism with those three. And similarly here, I'd like to keep three body parts. They don't have to be the same body parts. As I say, you probably can't keep the horn, but it would be nice to keep three body parts somehow. And so that's what I would normally recommend, keeping a metaphor to do with the body part, to do with being encouraged or emboldened or vindicated through the activity of the Lord. Is that all okay? If no more comments, then we can go to verse 2. Could somebody read verse 2, please?
Yes, I can try. Ein kadosh kadonai ki ein biltecha ve'ein tzur kelohinu.
Thank you. So again, we've got a tricolon, 3 parts instead of 2. Ein is interesting. The distribution of ein and the distribution of mi is very similar, and they seem to have very similar sort of function. This could easily have said mi kadosh kadonai and mi tzur kelohenu, but it says ein. One thing that I've noticed, and I've just noticed that Katie's there. Well, isn't that wonderful? Katie, you're very welcome. One thing that translators have learned from Katie's training manual that I suspect many of us, or maybe all of us, use, is that rhetorical questions can be expressed in other ways. And so I often teach people how to take rhetorical questions and express them in other ways. And so if it said mi kadosh kadonai, then I would encourage them to see that that really has the same kind of meaning as saying ein kadosh kadonai. However, there is a tendency that I've noticed that in translation, people are very ready to take away rhetorical questions in translation. So in other words, if it were to say mi kadosh kadonai, they would translate it as there is no one holy as the Lord. But they typically won't go the other way. It's not common in translation to go from ein kadosh kadonai and translate that as who is as holy as the Lord. And, you know, if they're equivalent, then kind of why not? You know, if the target language likes rhetorical questions, this would be a very appropriate place to put a rhetorical question in and express it in that way. You would have a problem with ein bilatecha, but I'm sure there would be a way of dealing with it. So that's just an observation really on the kind of culture of translation consulting and translation practice that we live in, that there have been certain things like rhetorical questions that specifically have been people have been taught how to deal with, but maybe their thinking tends to only go in one direction, and they're more likely to remove rhetorical features in their translation for clarity rather than sometimes adding them when they could do. Now, I'm sure there are some very good linguists here. I actually can't properly see who's here, but anyway, whoever's here, I'm sure there's some good linguists amongst you. And I would like your help now, because here we've been, we've got second and third person address. Ein kadosh kadonai ki ein biltecha. Obviously, it's second person, so it's address. And yet then there's this reference ki ein tzur kelohenu. Well, we probably skipped over the Adonai, which is a third person reference because it's a personal name. It doesn't say like you, Lord, but that didn't bother us too much. But when we get to Ein Tzur Kelohenu, suddenly translators tend to notice that it was a second person text. Then suddenly it doesn't say there is no rock like you, our God. It just says no rock like our God. It switched to third person. Now, is there a technical term? I know the technical term that is used for referring to oneself in the third person, which is Iliism. So there's a technical term for that. What's the technical term for referring to somebody else, addressing somebody in the third person? Like in German, you know, there is a polite second person, Sie, which is based on a third person plural form. Or when you go and visit a chief in Africa, quite often you have to say, I'm happy to see the chief. I hope that the chief has had a good day, and so on. You're actually face to face with the chief, but you have to talk to him in the third person. Is there a technical term for that? I'm not seeing anybody responding, but if you know the term, I would love to know it, because I suspect that some of you are much more linguistically gifted than I am. So that's what's happening. Yes.
Is that honorific?
I think you're quite right. It functioned as an honorific. Yes, I think it's a way of being polite. There are switches which it's kind of hard to tell if it's really meant as an honorific, but it's certainly true that third person, when addressing somebody, switching to the third person the most common place where that happens is in psalms and songs like this, in prayers. So it's addressed to God, so it's a fair conclusion that that's intended as a kind of honorific function. But I suspect there might be a very specific technical term for using third person in addressing somebody, but I don't know it. So here again, we have a key, don't we? So are we going to translate there is nobody holy like the Lord because there's nobody like you? Well, that sounds a bit odd to me. I would rather say there's no one holy like the Lord. Indeed. Of course, I don't use the word indeed. But anyway, absolutely, there's no one like you. It's an emphatic thing, a bit like in verse 1, key is emphatic rather than causal. But one of the funny things in this verse, I think, is this tur. Now, I hope we all know that tur, even though it's normally translated as a rock is wrong in English, isn't it? To say that God is a rock makes you think, well, okay, what are the salient features of a rock that are being, what's the point of comparison here? When we say God is a rock, do we mean he's hard or grey or round or surely not? The point of saying God is a rock is that he's a refuge, and the distribution of tur and those various words for a refuge or a high place are very similar. So clearly rock, tur doesn't refer to what we would normally call a rock, but rather a cliff. And if you go to Israel, you'll discover there are many places with these very high cliffs, and there are caves up in the cliffs. So, well, Masada is, of course, one of the very famous ones, where there was a settlement actually up on top of a high cliff that was very hard to attack. But there are places like that in Galilee as well, and throughout the country. So tur is a cliff, not a rock. But still, the first colon of verse 2 talks about God being holy. The second one talks about God as being unique. And the third one says that he's a refuge, a cliff, a high place that you can run to. Now, I find that quite unusual. Normally in the Psalms, we talk about, the praise of who God is in what are referred to as the hymns, and the praise of what God does in the Psalms of Thanksgiving. And yet here they seem to be mixed together. The idea of God being a refuge seems to be a Thanksgiving kind of element, not an inherent attribute of God. And it certainly doesn't seem to me to mean something similar to kadosh. If kadosh is about separateness and differentness and specialness, that's my personal preferred translation for kadosh, is that he's special. And ein belatecha seems to mean the same sort of thing. There's nobody but you, you're unique. Then why is it this refuge? I find that strange. Anybody have any solution to that?
Well, I was just noticing, Andy, in the Septuagint, I mean, we have dikaios for righteous,
yes,
in the place of rock, which is intriguing. I don't know, do we, remind me, do we have the full text of this in among the Dead Sea Scrolls, or is this? No, yeah. Okay. No,
if you look up my paper on the Tris Hagion paper that's on my academia.edu page, you'll see reference to 4Q Sameh. And if you look at my master's dissertation, you'll see kind of all that we've got of this song in 4Q Sameh, which is some little scraps, tiny little scraps. There's a reproduction of the little scraps of the manuscript in my master's dissertation.
Nice. Well, yeah.
But we don't have it. Of course, if I see dikaios in the Septuagint, then I assume that somebody misread tur as a tzaddik. Scribal error, kind of likely. I know people have their own inclination to go for scribal errors or not, and I probably jump more quickly than others do to assume that a scribe made a mistake. But the k that comes afterwards, phonetically similar to the half of tzaddik, would strengthen my point, but it's a conjectural emendation, isn't it, or a conjecture? We don't have any evidence that the Septuagint was thinking of tzaddik. We don't have any Hebrew manuscripts that say tzaddik, so I'm left with my supposition or idea, and it doesn't matter because, of course, in the work that we do, we translate the Hebrew text that's there, not conjectures. One other thing about this verse 2 is what comes to mind when you see Adonai and Eloheinu. I hope that when you hear Adonai Eloheinu, one of the things that comes to mind is the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. So it's got Adonai and it's got Eloheinu, and the other term there in the Shema is Echad. Well, what's the meaning of Ein Biltecha? Well, you are Echad, you are unique. Of course, the Shema is not talking about God's fundamental unity and monotheism or anything like that, but his uniqueness, that he's unique and distinctive. And so the En Beltecha means the same as Echad. So I hear, that's just maybe my feeling, I'm not trying to argue an academic point, but in verse 2 here, I hear echoes of the Shema. Let's go to verse 3. Somebody read verse 3.
Would you like to read, Rob?
Well, I'd rather wait to verse 4, actually.
Anybody else, verse 3?
I can take this one. Al tarbu tedaberu gevoha yetze atak mipichem ki el deot Adonai velo nitkenu alilot.
Very nice. Yeah, I'm quite encouraged to hear several of you reading very fluently. I certainly, like I said, I couldn't read very fluently until well after I'd done my PhD in Hebrew. So here we have obviously a change of addressee. It's an imperative addressed to plural addressee. As you know, the imperative in the negative becomes al with this then second person jussive. So al talbu is a second person jussive, isn't it? In translation, I always say that change of addressee is the best reason for a section break. You know, if you're looking for where you're going to put section breaks, then a change of addressee is one of the strongest arguments that there ought to be a section break there. We normally put a white line in between. If you can get it past your publishers, if you happen to work with publishers who don't like blank lines, but probably there ought to be a blank line between verses 2 and 3 in a translation because there's a change of addressee. And the language of this verse, the various interesting features about it, it seems to have some elements, I think, of wisdom language. This reference to pride, God being a God of knowledge, weighing up people's deeds. It rather sounds like wisdom literature, doesn't it? This tarbu is quite unusual. It's an adverbial verb, isn't it? It goes together with another verb. It's doing a lot of talking, or talking a lot. The tedaberu, al tarbu, tedaberu is not a common construction in biblical Hebrew. We do have verbs acting adverbially or modally, if you like. Rum is used in that way. But rabba, this verb to do something a lot, not common. You could probably find some examples around, but that's quite a special feature. The repetition of guvoha is very unusual in biblical Hebrew. Probably, again, you'd find some examples, but you find the odd things in the prophets and so on where there's a particular wordplay or something to do with it. But in a normal context like this is not common. Certainly not common as in some of the target languages that some of us work on, which often use ideophones being repeated. So that's quite unusual, and quite unusual that it didn't get lost in scribal transmission. I think quite often we discover that things like this are the things that get lost because a scribe hypercorrects or goes for the easier reading and then would end up deleting one of the guvoha. But this repetition survived. That's good. And I doubt that it's an addition. You know, according to the principle of lectio difficilio, really. Surely a scribe didn't add the second one. They must have. It must be original. It's interesting that there's a plural object here. There's a plural addressee, so he's talking to plural enemies. We already have plural enemies in verse 1, didn't we? And that those plural enemies, they have one mouth. We're going to come back to that again because they apparently have one bow as well when we get to verse 4. So they only have one mouth between them and one bow. And then God is a God of knowledges. This is quite unusual vocalization by the Masoretes. I would have expected el deut Adonai. The ut ending would be an abstract noun ending, quite a common abstract noun ending for knowledge. And yet this has been taken as a word, de'ah, in the plural, de'ot. So that seems quite an unusual choice. I'm sure there's a good basis for it, but it's not what I would have expected with my level of knowledge of biblical Hebrew. Then here, I hope that everybody recognizes the Ketiv and the Kareh marking there in paratext with the 1 star and then the 2 stars. And so there's been a Masoretic emendation to say that to him are weighed deeds, rather than saying, which the Ketiv says, are not weighed deeds. That's understood as not. Most of these kind of Masoretic Kareh readings are based on the assumption that there was that the original text did actually mean that. I don't think the Masoretes are saying that it doesn't say deeds are not weighed. It should say to him deeds are weighed. I think what the Masoretes are trying to tell us is that actually the normal spelling of this would have been Lamed Vav rather than Lamed Aleph. So actually it's an orthographic correction. They're not meaning to say that it has a different meaning. And we have that if you look at old inscriptions and so on, especially when it's things like plain or defective writing of vowels like the O vowel here, and the use of Aleph at the end of CV syllable. There are lots of variations. If you look at things like the Moabite stone and Hezekiah's tunnel inscription and those ancient Hebrew inscriptions, those are just the things that are quite likely to change. Aleph's at the end, and then plain or defective writing of a vowel. So in this case, I think it's just Masoret saying, no, actually, the proper way of spelling it is Lamed Vav, not Lamed Aleph. I think we can go to verse. Please stop me if there are things that you want me to comment on that I'm skipping over. Can't really talk about everything. I'll put a note in the chat if you'd like to. I'm very happy to be interrupted or whatever. If not, let's go to verse 4.
Keshet Giborim Chatim Benich Shalim Azaru Hayil.
Fine, thank you. So this is funny, isn't it? The Keshet is singular. So it's the bow of the heroes or the mighty men, Gibor. The Keshet Giborim, so there's plural of them. We know that I've got lots of enemies. We already know that from the previous verses. But between them, they apparently only have one bow. Of course, that's understood as there must be a what they call a constructio ad sensum. It must be understood in terms of the sense that that these are warriors and they each have one bow, just like in the previous verse, they each had one mouth. But then it gets even more complicated because we then have Chatim, which is plural. So we would have expected that the bows of the warriors are broken, or the bow of the warriors is broken, a singular predicate. Very odd. Some weird miscollocations there. Presumably they're original. They're nothing to do with scribal issues in the history of the text, but just that this was understood according to the sense and not according to normal collocation of number. In the second line, the Nishalim Azarochayel, the Azar is to strap something on yourself, like a belt or around your waist, and to put on Chayel. Chayel is strength or confidence. Most famously, of course, Ruth is an Eshet Chayel, good girl, or a courageous person. So courage, I think, is quite a nice translation for Chayel. They've strapped on courage, if you like. Just a little plug here for the Cambridge Digital Bible Research Project, which some of you have seen reference to recently on MAP, and others you might know separately. That has a main project, which is the Psalms layer by layer, but the Cambridge Digital Biblical Research team also have a metaphors project. which a number of SIL colleagues are involved in, as well as others from the academic world. And they're looking at conceptual metaphors, and they've looked at the conceptual metaphor, people are plants, which is in the background of the paper that I presented at the BT conference about the tree. But they're now moving on to a second major conceptual metaphor, which is attributes are clothes. And this, of course, is a very good example. They've strapped on courage. That's an attribute which is being conceptualized as clothes, and it's regarded as a conceptual metaphor. It's very extensive within the Hebrew Bible in various different sort of realizations, and there's at least 5 or 6 common verbs. Lavash, of course, is a very common one as well, azar, but there are others to do with putting on clothing or jewelry or various kinds of accoutrements on the body, and that's used as part of this conceptual metaphor to do with distinct attributes, whether it be courage or salvation, and I'm sure you can think of other good examples. He's clothed in garments of salvation and so on. There are lots of good examples. So if you're interested in those kind of things, do join that project. It's good. They're really doing useful work that I think will be very valuable for translators. Let's go to verse 5. Somebody read verse 5.
Seveim balehem niskaru ureevim hadelu ad akara yalda shiv'a berabet banim umlala.
Very nice, thank you. And very nice for getting the stress right. Umlala. You know, when you've read a bit of Hebrew, you tend to think it should be umlala, because you've learned you have to put the stress at the end. But in this case, it would be wrong if you did. You got it absolutely right. Umlala. A very unusual word, by the way. It's from the root amal, aleph mem lamed, and it's one of those polel or pulal roots. Quite an unusual stem. Sorry, not root, stem. Quite an unusual stem or verbal formation. Probably a foreign verbal formation, really. It's not germane to biblical Hebrew. So an unusual word at the end of that. Now, in verses 4 and 5, basically we have quite a simple structure. We have a subject and a predicate. They're nominal phrases, aren't they? Keshet giborim chatim. So the keshet giborim is the subject, and the chatim is the predicate. And then nifshalim is the subject, and azarochael is then a verbal phrase with 2 elements. And then the seveim is the subject, and balechem niskaru are selling themselves for bread. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then the next colon, this looks really weird. Ureevim chadelu. Firstly, it's too short because we've got used to these sort of 3 stressed elements. Normally that means 3 words, not always, but normally 1 stress element is 1 word, isn't it? So firstly, it looks too short. And if we try to translate it, we've got the hungry people are selling themselves for bread, and the satisfied people are selling themselves for bread, and the hungry people have stopped. They'll stop doing what? And then in the next colon, we have this very unusual ad akara yalada shiva. And what does ad mean? Ad normally means up to, and it's normally a time reference, isn't it? So up to the barren woman has given birth to 7. What does that mean? And that's why a very common emendation of this text, which again is a conjectural emendation, we don't have a very strong basis for it. Certainly we don't have a Hebrew text that says it. A very common emendation will be to take the ad together with the previous colon. And so the second line of verse 5 would be read, Ureevim chadelu od. So this could be vocalized with an O vowel, and in the meaning of yet, and the hungry people have stopped for now, or we would look for some kind of adverbial time sort of reference to try and translate od, but that would then put us in a better position to translate this starting with akara yalada shiv'a rabat banim umlala. The structure would work an awful lot better if we could just take that ad and move it up there. Now, you'll have you'll work with projects, they'll have their own policy on textual criticism and whether they're ready to make these kind of changes. But that one I would think is quite a strong change that needs to be made. In terms of translation of the first colon, selling themselves for bread, don't we all do that? We all give away our time in order to get money so that we can eat. So in translation of that first colon, it seems to me very important that people be encouraged to use an expression which indicates slavery, not gainful employment. Selling yourself for bread suggests just what everybody does, you know, working to make money so that you can eat. It needs to be something about selling oneself into slavery. It needs to be something much stronger. So that's verse 4 and 5. They have a rather clear structure. Once we get into verses 6 and 7, they also have quite a clear common structure. So I'm trying to sort of press ahead a little bit because of time. Maybe somebody could read verses 6 and 7 together. Somebody who hasn't read yet? Go ahead, don't be shy.
Okay, I will read. Yeah. Adonai memit umhaye morid shul vaya'al. Adonai morish mashpil af morimem.
Thank you very much. Very nice. So as you can see, these are mostly they're participles. Most of them are hifil participles. Memit, causing to die. Mechaye, causing to live. Morid, causing to go down. Morish, ma'ashir, making people rich and poor. Mashpil, making people go down. And even in the next verse, verse 8, there's the mekim, lifting up. So all of these hifil participles. And the verse is very neat and tidy, isn't it? We've got the name of God at the beginning of verse 6 and verse 7, very sort of logical, nice opposites and so on. Everything's in very nice order. A little bit of creativity in adding the word af as a more emphatic word for and. Here, that's fine. So everything looks in order except this. The last word of verse 6 looks really very, very unusual. Why do we have all these participles and suddenly we have a Waictol form? Well, of course, people could jump to all sorts of theologizing about this. And he once raised up, is Hannah talking about her specific personal experience, or is she being prophetic and she's talking about the resurrection of Jesus? You know, translators do those things. Really, really shouldn't. It's not right to the text to abuse it in that way and twist it to fit with all sorts of other unrelated things. I think it's quite possible that this could be a scribal error. I've mentioned that before. So it would ma'aleh would be the hifil participle of Allah, to go up, to cause to go up. So in other words, a vav and a yod would have been written there instead of a mem. And then ma'aleh would have been a problem because if you've got the hey at the end, then you have the wrong number of, it feels like you've got the wrong number of syllables. Adonai memit u'mechaye morid she'ol u'ma'aleh. Well, maybe okay, we'd even get a bit of rhyme, wouldn't we, with the mechaye ma'aleh? Maybe. So it could be a scribal issue. I actually think it's more likely to be a different type of scribal issue, because it is very unusual to have these participles and then a Waictol form. But it is less unusual to have what we have in verse 8, which is a participle mekim, and then this Yiktol form, which is yarim. Now, that does happen from time to time. That would be a Yiktol for present habitual, together with the mekim, which is for present continuous. Well, habitual and present continuous, really rather similar concepts, aren't they? And they go together reasonably well. So this, what we have in verse 8, this tense switching between a participle and a Yiktol form is not that odd. So I think it's rather more likely that the consonants here are quite right, but the vowels might not be in line with what was intended originally, and it actually should be v'ya'al. Or perhaps if it's going to be a hifil, it will be something like v'yo'el, or some kind of a Hifil, one of those Hifil forms, from some kind of root, which is like Allah with the hey at the end, although we quite often have variations on those roots that have yods at the beginning and so on. Anyway, it could be a yictal form for it to be a v yictal rather than a vayictal. Seems to me more likely. Otherwise, I just can't explain it. It says what it says, and we translate what it says, of course. We need to be faithful to what it says. But I don't think we necessarily have to translate this as "and he has raised up" to put it in the past. It's clear from the context of verses 6 and 7 that this is all present, general present. So he causes to go down to Sheol, and he brings up. And my last comment, because I'm looking at the time, would be that let's bear in mind that these verses 4, 5, 6, 7, it's all talking about general things that God has done. Some of them seem rather specific, like the barren woman who got 7 children, even though we know she only got 6. And others are more general things. But these general things, as he, especially at the beginning of verse 6, he causes to die and causes to come alive. We really shouldn't, on the basis of that, think that there's a theology here of resurrection. Absolutely not at this time in the development of theology and understanding in the Old Testament. Resurrection ideas, the very earliest appear in Isaiah and Daniel, perhaps, but most people would say they don't really appear until 2 Maccabees. And that's part of God's progressive revelation, developing an understanding that there is an afterlife, resurrection. So really, we ought to read this text and other Psalms that say similar things in terms of getting so sick that you feel like you're dead and are lifted up off your deathbed. And we have lots of metaphors in English too about, I'm dying, or I'm starving, or I'm, dying of thirst or something. We use that kind of hyperbole in our normal language, so it's not really that strange. We ought to avoid jumping to theological conclusions when we have hyperbolic expressions in the Bible. Now we've used up our time, and I know one person's already left. I would suggest that we continue with this next month. Is that right? Drew's the boss, so Drew, tell us what we should do.
Yeah, no, we want to be mindful of your time. Andy, thank you so much. We will stop here. And then if you're happy to lead the discussion again on March 2nd, we will look forward to picking up wherever you desire to. But this has been fantastic. Thank you. We will stop now. I don't know. We just have kind of like 1 minute. If anybody wants to tell Andy, thank you. I guess we don't really have time for questions, but maybe next time or yet. Okay, good. Well, I'm going to